The kids I babysit have a code word for danger, and they used it when their grandfather showed up. I'd been babysitting the Whitmore kids for about 4 months when I first heard about the code word. It was a Wednesday afternoon, and I was helping 6-year-old Lily with her homework while her older brother Owen played video games in the living room. Their mom Natalie had just started a new job at the hospital and needed someone reliable 3 days a week after school until she got home around 7. The pay was good, and the kids were sweet, so it seemed like an easy gig. That day, Lily looked up from her math worksheet and asked me if I knew their special word. I said I didn't know what she meant, and she glanced at Owen, who paused his game and walked over. He was 9 and took his role as big brother seriously, always making sure Lily stayed safe. Owen explained that their mom taught them a code word to use if they ever felt unsafe or needed help but couldn't say it directly. The word was lighthouse. If either of them said lighthouse in a sentence, it meant something was wrong and I needed to pay attention. I asked why they needed a code word, and Owen's face got serious in a way that seemed too old for a 9-year-old. He said their grandfather wasn't allowed to see them anymore, and if he ever showed up, they were supposed to use the word. Lily added that Grandpa used to be nice, but then he got mean and scared Mommy. She said sometimes people's brains get sick and they don't act like themselves anymore. I could tell Natalie had worked hard to explain it in a way that made sense to them without being too scary. I told them I understood and would remember the code word, then asked if they wanted to tell me what their grandfather looked like so I'd know if I saw him. Owen pulled out his mom's phone, which she'd left for emergencies, and showed me a photo from 2 years ago. A tall man with gray hair and a thick beard, smiling at the camera with his arms around both kids. He looked like a normal grandfather, and that somehow made it worse. That conversation stuck with me, but I didn't think too much about it at the time. Natalie had seemed stressed when she hired me, but I figured it was just the normal chaos of being a single parent with a demanding job. She told me during the interview that the kid's father wasn't in the picture, and her own parents weren't available to help, which I now understood meant something more complicated than just being busy. Over the next few weeks, I noticed small things that seemed unusual. Natalie always texted me when she was exactly 5 minutes away from home. She'd installed cameras at every door and checked them obsessively on her phone. The kids knew not to answer the door for anyone, even people they recognized, unless their mom had specifically told them someone was coming. One evening when I mentioned that an older man had waved at us from across the street while we were getting the mail, Natalie's face went pale, and she made me describe him in detail before relaxing and saying it was just their neighbor. The afternoon everything changed started normally enough. I arrived at 3:30 like always and let myself in with the key Natalie had given me. Owen and Lily got home from school about 15 minutes later, dropped their backpacks in the hallway, and immediately started arguing about whose turn it was to pick the snack. I was mediating their debate between apple slices and crackers when someone knocked on the front door. The kids both froze instantly and looked at each other with wide eyes. I checked the camera feed on the tablet Natalie kept by the door and saw an older man standing on the porch holding a grocery bag. He had gray hair and a beard, thinner than in the photo, but definitely the same person. My stomach dropped as I realized this was their grandfather. Owen grabbed Lily's hand and pulled her toward the kitchen while I stood there trying to figure out what to do. The man knocked again, harder this time, and called out that he knew the kids were home because he'd seen them walk up the driveway. I told the kids to go upstairs to Owen's room and close the door while I handled this. Lily started to cry, and Owen put his arm around her shoulders, guiding her toward the stairs. As they reached the top, Owen turned back and said clearly, "I hope the lighthouse is still standing after that storm last week." My heart started pounding because I knew exactly what he meant. I pulled out my phone and texted Natalie that her father was at the door, then dialed 911 and kept my finger hovering over the call button. The man knocked again and said he just wanted to see his grandchildren for a few minutes. He said Natalie was being unreasonable and keeping them apart for no good reason. His voice sounded normal and friendly, which made the whole situation feel surreal. How could someone who sounded so calm and reasonable be dangerous enough that the kids needed a code word? I walked to the door but didn't open it, calling through the wood that Natalie wasn't home and he needed to leave. He asked who I was, and I told him I was the babysitter. There was a long pause before he said, "That was perfect," that I seemed like a responsible young person who would understand that grandparents have rights. He explained that his daughter was going through some things and had gotten confused about some incidents that never actually happened. He said the court case was all a misunderstanding, and he'd been cleared of any wrongdoing. His tone was so reasonable and persuasive that for a second I almost doubted what the kids had told me. Then I remembered Lily's face when she'd said Grandpa got mean and scared Mommy, and I knew I couldn't trust anything this man said. I told him again that he needed to leave and I was calling the police if he didn't. He laughed like I'd made a joke and said there was no need to overreact. He just wanted to drop off some presents he'd bought for the kids. Couldn't I at least take the bag from him? I said no and pulled out my phone so he could see it through the window. His friendly tone disappeared immediately. He started pounding on the door with his fist and yelling that these were his grandchildren and nobody had the right to keep him away from them. He said Natalie had poisoned their minds with lies and he was going to make sure everyone knew the truth. The kids could hear him from upstairs and I heard Lily crying louder. My hands were shaking as I actually called 911 this time. The dispatcher answered and I explained the situation as quickly as I could while the man kept pounding and shouting. She said officers were on the way and to stay inside with the doors locked and not engage with him anymore. I could hear her typing rapidly and asking for details about the protective order. I didn't know the details, so I texted Natalie again asking about it. She responded immediately saying there was a restraining order and he wasn't supposed to be within 500 feet of the house or the kids. She was leaving work right now and would be home in 20 minutes. Those 20 minutes felt like hours. The grandfather stopped pounding and everything went quiet for about 30 seconds. I checked the camera and saw him walking back to his car, an old blue sedan parked across the street. For a moment, I thought he was leaving, but instead he opened the trunk and pulled out a metal baseball bat. My entire body went cold as I watched him walk back toward the house swinging it casually. He called out that if I wasn't going to be reasonable about this, he'd find another way in. He walked around the side of the house toward the backyard, and I lost sight of him on the camera. I ran upstairs to Owen's room where both kids were huddled together on the bed. Owen had his arms around Lily and was whispering that everything would be okay. I told them police were coming and their mom was on her way home, and we just needed to stay quiet and safe up here. Then I heard glass breaking downstairs. He'd smashed the sliding door in the kitchen. I pushed the kids into Owen's closet and told them to stay there no matter what. Then I grabbed Owen's wooden baseball bat from beside his bed. My hands were slippery with sweat as I gripped it and positioned myself between the closet and the bedroom door. I could hear heavy footsteps downstairs, and the man calling out for Owen and Lily in a sing-song voice that made my skin crawl. He was saying he'd brought them presents and didn't they want to see what Grandpa bought them. His footsteps started coming up the stairs slowly, one at a time, and each creak of the wood made my heart pound harder. I could hear Lily crying quietly in the closet, and Owen shushing her gently. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs and paused. I held my breath and tightened my grip on the bat. Then his voice came from right outside the door saying he knew they were in there and they needed to stop playing games. The doorknob started to turn and I raised the bat above my head, ready to swing at anyone who came through. The door opened slowly, and I saw his face, angry and determined, nothing like the smiling grandfather from the photo. He saw me standing there with the bat and actually laughed, saying I was just a kid myself and needed to put that down before someone got hurt. He took a step into the room and I swung the bat as hard as I could, not aiming for his head but for his shoulder. It connected with a solid thunk, and he stumbled backward, dropping his own bat with a clatter. He grabbed his shoulder and swore, then lunged at me. I swung again but missed this time, and he caught the bat, yanking it out of my hands with more strength than I expected. Now we were both in the room and he was between me and the door, holding both bats. He told me I'd just made a very big mistake and he wasn't leaving without his grandchildren. That's when I heard sirens getting closer and his face changed from angry to panicked. He looked toward the window and then back at the closet where the kids were hiding. Police sirens were right outside now, and I heard car doors slamming. The man swore again and threw the bats on the floor, then ran out of the room and down the stairs. I heard him thundering through the house and the back door slamming. I ran to the closet and opened it, finding both kids clutching each other and shaking. I told them it was safe and the police were here, but Owen wouldn't let go of Lily. Police officers were coming through the front door now, calling out to announce themselves, and I yelled down that we were upstairs and safe. 2 officers came up with their weapons drawn, checking every room before lowering them. A female officer knelt down in front of the kids and introduced herself as Officer Williams, asking if they were hurt. Lily shook her head but couldn't stop crying. Owen just stared at the floor and held his sister tighter. Officer Williams said they'd caught the man trying to climb the back fence and he was in custody now. She asked if I could tell them exactly what happened. I walked them through everything from the first knock to him breaking in with the bat. Another officer was documenting the broken sliding door and taking photos of everything. More police arrived and started setting up a perimeter around the property. Natalie burst through the front door about 10 minutes later, wild-eyed and frantic, pushing past officers until she found us upstairs. She dropped to her knees and pulled both kids into her arms, sobbing and checking them over for injuries. They weren't physically hurt, but they were traumatized, and I could see that in the way they clung to their mother and wouldn't look toward the door. Natalie looked at me with tears streaming down her face and thanked me over and over for keeping them safe. An ambulance arrived even though nobody was seriously injured, and the paramedics checked everyone out while police continued documenting the scene. Detective Laura Sullivan showed up about an hour later, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes who'd apparently been assigned to the family's case months ago. Detective Sullivan sat down with Natalie in the living room while a victim advocate stayed with the kids upstairs. I could hear Natalie explaining through tears that her father had been diagnosed with early-onset dementia 2 years ago, and his personality had completely changed. He'd become paranoid and aggressive, especially toward her after her divorce. There had been an incident 8 months ago where he'd shoved her so hard she'd broken her wrist, and another time when he'd grabbed Owen roughly enough to leave bruises. The restraining order had been in place for 6 months, but he'd never violated it before. Natalie had thought maybe he'd accepted the boundaries, but now she realized he'd just been planning. Detective Sullivan said the violation of the restraining order, plus the breaking and entering, plus the assault on me, meant he'd be going to jail this time, not just getting a warning. She asked if I'd be willing to give a formal statement, and I said yes, even though my hands were still shaking. That night, after the police finally left and Natalie got the kids to bed, she sat me down at the kitchen table and apologized for putting me in danger. She said she should have been more explicit about the threat level when she hired me. I told her it wasn't her fault and I was glad I'd been there to protect the kids. She insisted on paying me triple for that day, and said she'd understand if I didn't want to come back. The truth was I was scared and shaken up, and the idea of being alone in that house again made my stomach hurt. But I also thought about Owen using the code word at exactly the right moment, and Lily's brave face even though she was terrified. I told Natalie I'd keep babysitting, but I wanted her to walk me through every security measure in the house and teach me exactly what to do if anything like this happened again. We sat there until past midnight, going over emergency protocols and contact numbers and the locations of every camera and alarm. She showed me the panic button app on her phone that connected directly to police dispatch. The next morning, I went to the police station to give my formal statement to Detective Sullivan. She recorded everything while I walked through every detail I could remember. She showed me photos of the man being arrested, his shirt torn and his face red with fury as officers handcuffed him. She explained that he'd be held without bail because he'd violated a protective order and the judge considered him a flight risk. There would be a hearing next week and I'd need to testify about what happened. The idea of standing in a courtroom and talking about it in front of him made me want to throw up, but Sullivan said my testimony would be crucial for keeping him locked up longer. She also mentioned that Natalie's father had a history I didn't know about. Before the dementia diagnosis, he'd been arrested twice for assault, once against Natalie's mother before she passed away, and once against a neighbor. The dementia had apparently removed whatever impulse control he'd maintained before. I started having nightmares after that day. I'd wake up sweating and seeing his face in the bedroom doorway, or I'd dream that I hadn't locked the closet and he'd gotten to the kids. My roommate noticed I was jumpy and having trouble sleeping, and finally got me to talk to someone at the University Counseling Center. The therapist said I was experiencing trauma symptoms, and that was completely normal after what I'd been through. She taught me breathing exercises and grounding techniques for when I felt panicked. She also said it was okay if I decided to stop babysitting for the Whitmores, that I didn't owe them anything just because I'd been there during the crisis. But every time I thought about quitting, I remembered Lily asking if I'd still come over next week because she didn't want a new babysitter who didn't know about the lighthouse. The code word had worked exactly how it was supposed to, and that meant something. The preliminary hearing happened on a Friday morning, and I had to miss my classes to be there. The courthouse was cold and intimidating with its high ceilings and marble floors. Natalie met me outside the courtroom looking exhausted, dark circles under her eyes like she hadn't slept in days. She said the kids were staying with her best friend today because she didn't want them anywhere near the building. Inside the courtroom, I saw her father for the first time since that day. He was wearing an orange jumpsuit and handcuffs, looking smaller and older than I remembered. His lawyer was a tired-looking public defender who kept sighing and shuffling papers. The prosecutor was a sharp woman named Diana Foster who'd already talked to me twice about my testimony. She called me to the witness stand and I had to put my hand on a Bible and swear to tell the truth. My voice shook as I described everything that happened, from the first knock to swinging the bat at him. The defense attorney asked if I'd actually seen him hurt anyone or just heard the kids' stories about past events. I said I saw him break into the house with a weapon and chase me upstairs, which was enough for me. The judge was an older man with gray hair who listened carefully and took notes. When both sides had presented their evidence, he ruled that there was probable cause for all the charges, and the defendant would remain in custody until trial. The bail amount was set at $500,000, which everyone knew his Social Security checks couldn't cover. Natalie cried with relief when the judge announced it. Outside the courtroom, Diana Foster explained that the trial wouldn't happen for several months because the court calendar was backed up. In the meantime, the restraining order would remain in effect and be extended to include me since I'd been threatened. She said I should document anything suspicious, any unknown cars parked near my apartment or campus, any feeling of being watched or followed. The dementia made him unpredictable, and they couldn't be sure what he'd do if he somehow made bail. That possibility terrified me more than I wanted to admit. I went back to babysitting the following Wednesday, and the kids were different than before. Owen was quieter and stayed close to wherever I was in the house. Lily had started wetting the bed again, according to Natalie, something she hadn't done since she was 4. Both of them flinched at unexpected sounds and wouldn't go near the sliding door that had been repaired with new reinforced glass. Natalie had installed an alarm system that beeped whenever any door or window opened, and the constant monitoring made the house feel like a fortress. The kids were seeing a therapist twice a week who specialized in childhood trauma, and slowly they started to seem more like themselves. Owen smiled at jokes again. Lily stopped asking every 5 minutes if Grandpa could get out of jail, but I could tell something had fundamentally changed in how they moved through the world. They'd learned too young that people who were supposed to love you could also hurt you. 3 months passed before the trial date was set. During that time, I'd become almost part of the Whitmore family. I was there 4 days a week now because Natalie had been promoted and needed more help. I attended Owen's school concert and Lily's soccer games. I helped with homework and made dinner and read bedtime stories. Natalie said I was more than just a babysitter. I was someone the kids trusted completely, and that trust was precious after what they'd been through. The night before I was supposed to testify at trial, I couldn't sleep at all. I lay in bed rehearsing my answers to the questions Diana Foster had prepared me for. I worried about forgetting important details or saying something wrong that would hurt the case. My roommate brought me chamomile tea and sat with me until I finally dozed off around 3 in the morning. The trial lasted 4 days. I testified on the second day, walking through everything again with Diana guiding me through questions. The defense attorney tried to make it seem like I'd overreacted, that an elderly man with dementia wasn't really a threat, and I'd been the one who escalated by swinging a bat at him. Diana objected multiple times, and the judge sustained most of her objections. When I stepped down from the witness stand, my legs were shaking so badly I nearly tripped. Natalie testified next, describing years of escalating violence and control from her father. She talked about the broken wrist and the bruises on Owen and the constant fear she'd lived with. Owen's pediatrician testified about the injuries he'd documented. Detective Sullivan presented all the evidence they'd collected, including security camera footage from a neighbor that showed the man walking up to the house with the bat in his hand. The defense tried to argue diminished capacity due to dementia, but the prosecutor showed evidence that he'd planned the visit carefully, proving he knew what he was doing was wrong. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before coming back with guilty verdicts on all charges: breaking and entering, violating a restraining order, assault with a deadly weapon, attempted kidnapping. The judge scheduled sentencing for 3 weeks later. Natalie collapsed in her chair sobbing when she heard the verdicts, and I sat beside her with my arm around her shoulders. Outside the courthouse, Diana told us that with his prior record and the severity of the crimes, he was looking at significant prison time, probably 8 to 12 years. Given his age and health issues, that might mean he'd never be released. The thought should have made me feel safer, but instead I just felt sad for everyone involved. Owen and Lily had lost their grandfather not because he died, but because his brain betrayed him and turned him into someone dangerous. Natalie had lost her father years ago to dementia and now had to watch him go to prison. There were no winners here, just damage control. Sentencing day came on a morning in late October. The courtroom was packed with people I didn't recognize, apparently advocates for dementia patients and prison reform, who thought incarcerating someone with a degenerative brain disease was inhumane. The judge listened to their arguments and then asked if anyone wanted to speak on behalf of the victims. Natalie stood up and walked to the microphone with a piece of paper shaking in her hands. She talked about loving her father and grieving for the man he used to be, but also about the terror of living under constant threat. She described Lily's nightmares and Owen's anxiety and her own inability to trust anyone. She said she wanted her father to get medical help, but she also needed her children to be safe, and she didn't know how to balance those two truths. The judge listened carefully and thanked her for her statement. Then he sentenced her father to 10 years in a prison facility with a specialized dementia care unit. He'd be eligible for compassionate release if his condition deteriorated to the point where he was no longer a threat, but that decision would be made by a review board, not automatically. After sentencing, life slowly started to return to something like normal. The alarm system became background noise we barely noticed. The kids stopped checking every room before entering. Natalie started sleeping through the night again instead of waking up at every sound. I continued babysitting and watching these two kids grow up and heal. Owen started playing baseball again and was really good at it. Lily joined a drama club and discovered she loved performing. Both of them knew the code word lighthouse would probably never be needed again, but they still remembered it. Some things you don't forget even after the danger has passed. Natalie told me one evening after the kids were in bed that she felt guilty for how everything had turned out. She loved her father and hated seeing him in prison, deteriorating further every time she visited. But she also knew she'd made the only choice available to protect her children. Sometimes there are no good options, just less terrible ones. A year after the trial, I graduated and moved across the country for a job. The goodbye with Owen and Lily was harder than I expected. These kids had taught me things about resilience and courage that I'd carry forever. Natalie gave me a photo of the three of us at Lily's 7th birthday party, all of us smiling like we didn't have a care in the world. On the back she'd written, "Thank you for being our lighthouse." I cried on the plane ride across the country, not because I was sad exactly, but because some experiences change you permanently, and you can't go back to who you were before. I learned that normal-looking people could be dangerous, that love and fear could exist in the same relationship, that sometimes protecting someone meant testifying against their family member in court. Those weren't lessons I'd wanted to learn at 22, but they'd made me stronger and more aware. This was just one of many wild stories. Stick around by hitting subscribe, and let me know what you thought in the comments.